Welcome back, everyone. I hope you were as inspired as I was by those Inspiration Award winners. We did not get a chance to take a little nature break, but I feel like I've had a nature break getting to see W.D. Thompson and that aerial shot of Lake Charlotte with just trees as far as the eye can see. Really love the stories and the personal passion from Patrick Noonan and Miss Shirley Nichols. So congratulations to them on being recognized, and we will have 3 more Inspiration Award winners. And Sophia, you're doing an excellent job with teeing these up and giving them the attention they deserve. It's time right now to welcome our second. It's time right now for our second keynote speaker, Kofi Boone. Kofi Boone is a university faculty scholar and professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at NC State University in the College of Design. Kofi's award-winning work in landscape architecture elevates issues of environmental justice with specializations in democratic design, digital media, and interpreting cultural landscapes. Kofi serves on the board of directors of the Core Network, as well as the Landscape Architecture Foundation, where he is president-elect. He is also on the advisory board of the Black Landscape Architects Network. I'd like to welcome Kofi Boone to the stage. Welcome, Kofi.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be with you today.
Excellent. I know that, and I'm going to just jump right into it, that when we recorded your keynote, it was days before the Derek Chauvin ruling, which you mentioned in your remarks, waiting to hear the outcome. And just to kind of bring us up to speed, I was wondering if you could share your reaction to the ruling, as well as kind of what you're hearing in your circles, as well as in North Carolina.
Sure. Thanks for starting with that. Encouragement about the accountability that's being demonstrated right now with regards to Chauvin, and hopefully with the sentencing that's equivalent, because I think a signal needs to be sent that that kind of behavior is just unacceptable in society. I know during that same period of time, we were made aware of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, who lost their lives. Ahmaud Arbery, his attackers have just been accused of hate crimes. And so there's some accountability happening there, as well as Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, with the Department of Justice investigation of that entire police department. And so there's some systemic changes that should be underway. In our own backyard in North Carolina, the murder of Andrew Brown Jr. In Elizabeth City recently has sent shockwaves here. And so we're hoping for some systemic change.
Thank you. I want to turn our attention to your talk. Your talk is called Revisiting the Commons. And for our viewing audience, can you just give a kind of a high-level understanding of the Commons and its context, and also how that relates to our conversation today with parks?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think the Commons, the most accessible way of describing it is an analogy of shared pasture land, and sort of dates back to the idea of shared community resources, where for common good, we all share those particular resources for a commonwealth. And a lot of people know about it from its critique. So Garrett Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons in 1968 was a very influential article which talked about, these shared resources enable the free rider sort of syndrome and people extracting more benefit, and there's no accountability. And so, he was sort of painting a very negative picture of this idea that commons is so easily exploited and we have such few resources. But that critique has been challenged. Susan Cox has a great critique of it, but the biggest one is Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, who said that, really this idea of shared resources requires strong institutions to partner and to collaborate. And so this idea of commons expands the idea of the potential of the park as solely a recreational resource or even a public health resource to one that can build other forms of wealth in communities. And so that's the spirit of the talk. And this has been extended further by the Schumacher Center, who really pioneered the idea of community land trusts in the United States.
Yes, well, thank you. And I think it also, one of our themes is that in order for parks to be relevant, they need to be about more than just parks. So I think that tees up your conversation quite nicely. So at this point, we're going to cut to Kofi's keynote. Please put your questions in the Q&A. If you have any thoughts or reactions, put those in the chat. Following the keynote, we'll be back here to answer some questions and to engage in the issues that have been raised. Thank you for being here, Kofi.
Thank you.
Great. With that introduction, I'd like to begin the keynote, revisiting the commons, which is a topic that we've been discussing in great detail recently here, and I think may offer value to the conference and what you're going to be doing today. As a beginning, I'd like to offer some acknowledgments, beginning with a land acknowledgement. And I'm coming to you from the land of the Eno, the Saponi, the Lumbee, and many other indigenous groups. We recognize their rights and their strength, and we ask permission to share these words from their land. I'm also coming to you from the American Southeast, and that landscape has been written in part with the legacy of slavery and the enslavement of African people. And this map is an unfamiliar map to many people, but it indicates the enslaved population by county in the Confederate States. The darker the color on the map, the more enslaved population of African people. And although we can't make out the specifics, it also works as a geology map. So for people who are landscape architects and interested in the land, a lot of the places where the largest populations were plantations, and that was because of the landscape itself, the fertile soils. And so the legacy of indigenous people and the loss of their land rights, the legacy of the period of slavery and the enslavement of African Americans and the fight for freedom are front of mind as we begin this conversation. Of course, we're still coming out of the twin pandemics. One, COVID-19, and dealing with an unprecedented event that dealt with a deadly disease, and my condolences to people who have suffered due to that situation. But also in the summer of 2020, the very visible and traumatic murder of George Floyd at the hands of the police. And we're still waiting on the outcome of the current legal actions. But those two events unleashed an unprecedented amount of resistance and protests in public spaces and in streets. And for people concerned with parks and open space, it's important to note that those places were seen as the civic spaces where people could express themselves and their frustrations and reactions to trauma. We celebrate those places. And one of the places where that occurred, Central Park in New York City, which in many places is the indicator of the value of public parks to cities, and the brainchild of this gentleman, Frederick Law Olmsted, who will be celebrating his 200th birthday next year in 2022. His legacy as an abolitionist, as an agitator, as a political operative, as well as someone who conceived of many, many, many of the innovations that we still use today dealing with parks and open space, is responsible for providing the vision to develop spaces to allow people to inhabit and thrive in those places moving forward. But with all the benefits, the health benefits, the economic benefits, the cultural benefits of parks and open spaces, another legacy that's embedded in the birth of really the public park movement in America is displacement. We don't often think of parks and open spaces as agents of the displacement of communities. But even in the seeds of Central Park, we see that there's this tension between the ability to have land rights, property rights, and ownership for marginalized populations and the mainstream attitudes of the environment represented here by parks. And it's important to note that before there was a Central Park, there was self-built communities in the footprint of that actual park, one of which was Seneca Village, a self-built African-American community that was completely erased in the construction of the park. We don't often think of parks as agents of change, but in contemporary conversations around the country, this is a concern, particularly in Black and Brown communities, and coming in the aftermath of what we witnessed last summer in the murder of George Floyd and with the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic, was this real concern by communities that as we start to grow and develop, that they may lose their ability to stay in place. This is not the only example. This comes from Mindy Fuller Thompson, who proposed the concept of root shock, who talked about the ideas, the psychological impacts of losing one's home place. And in it, she profiled the consequences of urban renewal in Pittsburgh and also in the South Bronx of New York, lasting mental health, trauma, and physical health issues due to the erasure of those particular communities. And she puts it in the context of serial displacement, where every generation since African Americans and Black and Brown people have been in this country, we've had to deal with huge policies that have displaced communities in the interest of all of us, ranging from redlining, which is extremely well covered in the color of law, by Rothstein, to urban renewal and freeway construction. Every era, there's a shock to the system, and it has real consequences. Part of it is the wealth gap between Black and brown households and white households in the United States, where the very property that people own is not valued in the same way because of the color of their skin and the legacy of some of these policies. And in this case, wealth accumulation in private property, not public, but in the context of improvements in places, you can see from this chart a 100 to 1 ratio in some cases of wealth disparities. And this wealth disparity compounds. It prevents communities from building and passing assets along to the next generations, investing in their infrastructure in their home places, and causes some skeptical attitudes about the value of public space and open space when there's such a disparity on the private side. Coming back to the legacy of summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, one thing that's important to note is that George Floyd was from Houston, Texas, and from the Fourth Ward of Houston, Texas. And that plays a significant role in our history as a country, but particularly in Black history, because the Emancipation Proclamation was declared, which allowed enslaved African people to become citizens and free members of our society. But people in Texas didn't get that information for 2 years. So 2 years after emancipation is when this declaration that's on the screen was read to the people of Texas. So for 2 years, they were free and they didn't know it. And it led to massive movements in Texas, and in particular in Houston. The formation of this group, the Colored People's Festival and Emancipation Park Association in 1872, led by the Reverend John Henry Jack Yates, who pulled together with some of his parishioners at Antioch Church and people in that community to purchase 12 acres in Houston and form a park that was dedicated to the celebration of what is now known as Juneteenth, celebrating that 2-year delayed information to free Black people, that they were in fact free. And so purchased with the explicit purpose of celebrating this festival and leveraging economic and social and political empowerment around the public space. What's important to note is Emancipation Park was the first park in Houston. It predates the park system in that city. So African Americans coming out of enslavement, first choices of what to do with money and with land, purchase land for a public park for the celebration and the building of rituals to hold that community together. So there is a legacy in these communities of that, of collective action, of collective work, and what we may call the commons. So this is an article that was published that I worked on with my colleague, Julian Edgemon, that really proposed this idea of, is this a time to revisit that legacy of the commons, of collective and cooperative ownership of properties, of land, in combination with the many other transformative strategies that are coming out of our new understanding post-racial reckoning. And the rest of this presentation will get into some of the details of this concept. And for people who really want to know about some of this history, this is an excellent book, Collective Courage, by Jessica Nemhart, which really chronicles the origins of the cooperative movement broadly in the United States, but focuses on Black communities and how that was integral to people with modest economic means to acquire and impact their home places, develop businesses, own landscapes, and influence massive change, particularly in the 20th century. One of the luminaries of this was W.B. Du Bois, who, among other things, was fascinated with the cooperative model, saying that, in communities large and small, it was the most effective tool for African Americans and Black people to navigate assist capitalism, where less capitalized and has value businesses are, and people with modest means can come together, pool their resources to develop businesses and to thrive in the midst of incredible hostility in the face of that. As an anecdote, I'm a big comic book fan. And when I was in high school, The Watchmen came out. And in HBO last year, The Watchmen was turned into a miniseries. And it was updated from that original comic and starts with the bombing of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood District, what was then known as Black Wall Street. Over 300 thriving middle-class businesses in the community that was decimated due to direct racism, white supremacy, and white hostility. What's important to note is that it was a product of this cooperative and collective action, but it wasn't the only one. What Du Bois noted and mapping in his documents is there were over 8,000 of these cooperatives around the country. And there was another Black Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina, formed by two businesses, NC Mutual Life Insurance Company and Farmers and Mechanics Bank, both on Parish Street, both of which exist today. And until the 1960s were the largest employers of African Americans in the country. So this idea of pooling modest means for cooperative interests and locating it to invest in place is not foreign to Black and Brown communities, but it has been impaired due to many policies and other elements. From the land side, community land trusts have a very long history. Some date it back to even the thinking of Ebenezer Howard as he started to speculate on the value of the Garden City concept. But in the United States, it was seen in the post-civil rights era as a way to extend civil rights actions by Black people, particularly in the South. So this woman who's on the screen right now, Fannie Lou Hamer, proposed this idea of Mississippi Freedom Farms and had a large acreage that was specifically geared to cooperative land rights that enabled the poorest of us, particularly farmers in rural areas, to have access to land and to resource and capital. The image on the right is the pig bank that she created as a part of that process. And it really was an opportunity for people to learn to share, to build from the bottom up. So this is credited as one of the contemporary precedents for community land trust, but it really grew to another level after the work of Charles Sherrod and Robert Swan, particularly in 1967, their work which grew up into the Schumacher Center and really codified community land trust models as a way to separate the land from the value generated from the land so that people were not burdened with lack of land ownership and lack of resources to hold the land and could really use the land to uplift their particular communities. They were the ones that really pioneered and codified that process. The process is pretty straightforward, where in a capitalist society where land is property and is subject to incredible increases in real estate value based on speculation or depressing that value due to racism and other strategies, removing that, right, that's in collective ownership, but allowing people whose homes are built on those crops grown, industries grown, to not have to pay the value of the land, but pay directly for the services or what they're developing from it. Give some back so that the collective can operate, but take some with them. It has been a very effective wealth building model tied to the land over time. One of the great urban land trusts, one of the great models is the Dudley Street Initiative, sort of the brainchild of Mel King in Boston, and Roxbury in Massachusetts. And this idea was there was a period of time, it's hard for some of us to believe that Boston was not always a thriving, booming city. There was a period where people were not investing in the city. Roxbury, because of historically racially discriminatory zoning, had not attracted development, did not have resources even within the city. And so this idea that before the city decided to move forward, residents of Roxbury put in a moratorium on development, saying, hey, we need to organize. We're more agile. We're able to understand community context and operate faster than the city can. And we're allowed to form a land trust to control a key part of property in Roxbury neighborhood and develop this particular model. Today it thrives. It moves from agriculture to affordable housing to business development and beyond. And it has resisted some of the forces of displacement and gentrification that were prominent around its boundaries in many American cities. So this idea of cooperative ownership, cooperative work, cooperative land tied to public space improvements is another frontier that we all need to take a look at. Rondo, which was a Black community in St. Paul and Minneapolis in the early 20th century, was a thriving district of neighborhoods and houses and businesses that really used and deployed that cooperative model that DuBois wrote about so effectively, but was the victim of urban renewal and freeway construction. Here, I-94 sliced right through the community. And so as a strategy for rebuilding and recovery, they recovered that history of cooperatives and started to highlight those for ideas of heritage tourism and inspiration for new business structures. It also formed a community land trust so that moving forward, that enabled local residents to be the first in line to benefit from public improvements, including open space, that they could control land values and real estate values. In these images, you see the museum and the educational center, which was designed in the Rondo neighborhood to tell that story of what it was a century ago, where it's going now, and how it can involve local people. So it's actually touched the ground in the public space and open space now. And broader strategies, right? How do we not just recognize that these things had occurred, not just reconcile, but repair them, right? So the idea of the freeway itself being transformed, covered with a park, to knit the community back together, and literally on top of the footprint of the freeway, a new business district, which marks the reclaiming of that and the restoration of that particular legacy in Rondo. There are agencies and organizations that are starting to think about how public spaces and green spaces alone, as they provide value to communities, moving forward is not necessarily enough, just the public space itself. It's about what it enables. Can it enable job creation? Can it enable more participation in voting and civic action? Can it participate in stabilizing communities and enabling people to stay in place, acquire affordable housing, and fulfill their basic needs, in addition to the recreation and health functions the park can provide? So reimagining the civic commons is a great step in that direction. And one part of it is building a database and evidence base that these changes are possible and they're occurring. So the Measuring the Civic Commons, through a series of pilot programs across the country, is starting to build that database and that evidentiary base. At another scale, how do we start to anticipate the changes that large public spaces and open spaces will have in our communities? How transformative can they be? Do they have to stay transactional, where the private sector and adjacent lands are not considered, and it's literally what's within the box of whatever our park or open space happens to be? We're starting to see examples of people considering a larger box, right, where the park operates within the city and operates within the needs of communities. And so the 11th Street Bridge Park project across the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C., and the Equitable Development Plan that was developed for that starts to get at that, which is to say the impact of the park goes way beyond the immediate boundaries of the park. In this case, it goes for multiple census tracts, miles away from the park. They're imagining economic, social, cultural, and political impacts. And knowing that, a 10-year plan in advance to prepare these communities to be ready for these. So how do we start to focus on how the park can enable job creation, workforce development, small business enterprise development, moving people from renters to owners, and really creating more stable legacy and affordable housing opportunities. Arts and culture, really celebrating through ritual how people really use the space and tell the history of their communities. And how do we do it before, during, and after? And so this project is underway, and we're all looking at it with great excitement to see if this offers a new model of not just thinking about the park and the open space, but collectively, what can we do through other systems? And as we've all experienced, during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we're all in our homes, a new frontier is opening for us regarding commoning and sharing things and being cooperative. On this end of the spectrum, for recreation and leisure and stress and really connecting culturally, Club Quarantine emerged, where using social media as a way to really, from wherever you are in your home place, to feel connected to a broader community, to music and arts and culture, took on a life of its own. And many others sprung off, from the versus battles to other things. So this is actually a compliment. It's not to diminish the fact that it's about, in this case, primarily recreation, leisure, and entertainment. Those are essential and critical for maintaining cultural ties, for maintaining a sense of humanity, and for building bridges between each other. But the question then becomes, can this new process also point in the direction of things that can direct how we think about public spaces and open spaces? And a colleague of mine is doing some really interesting work in this regard, where Justin Garrett Moore, who's now at the Mellon Foundation, a native of Indianapolis, has been really active in reclaiming land and rethinking it in his hometown for community benefit, but not in the traditional way where we all convene and meet in person and we deal with things in the physical world. He is leveraging digital technology and the social media world to make decisions, accrue assets, and affect change. So through the Urban Pacts program, which has been going on for many years, essentially an IOB for urban design and for urban landscape, he has been very successful in starting to break down strategies and elements in ways that people can essentially microfinance and pay as they go, and influence decision making, even if they're dispersed and only connected through the computer, resulting in really significant change. So the first grocery store, which is a bodega style in this neighborhood in a generation, was created in this way, where not only were the funds raised, but relationships built with suppliers and producers, and also marketing to encourage consumers to work it. So today there's a grocery store in the neighborhood where it's mostly funded and engaging people who have never been to the place, who have really only done it over social media. And it has grown up into another realm of impact with his work in Rwanda, providing affordable housing in Kigali and in other cities in that fast growing and fast developing African nation. And so in this case, it's even global, where people who are concerned and rally around the issue and the cultural imperatives implied, providing first class places to live, may have never been to Rwanda, or may not have ever connected with folks there, but through this commons that was developed with information, with technology, we're able to participate. And the good part about this particular project, which is also a lesson, is using it as a way to invest in local workers and local people, so that after this project is over, people come away with skilled trades and with new job and workforce opportunities, not just the satisfaction of building quality, affordable housing. So we end where we began, with revisiting the commons. The commons as an idea of building off of our legacy of cooperation, of including the legacy of people who have been most marginalized, either through direct actions discussed through the root shock and serial displacement piece, or indirect actions, where just the decline of cities and places. How can parks and open spaces play an active role of activating, anchoring, and connecting to these incredible legacies and extending them into the future, so that we can extend the commons not just from the public space and the open space, but to the adjacent landscapes, to the property, to the business development, to information, and ultimately to agency. With that, I'll say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for elevating the commons into our conversation on the new case for parks, Kofi. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you. You too. I appreciate the time.
So I'm going to get into my questions. Before I do, two things that I wanted to mention that are housekeeping for our audience. I know that folks have had some weather-related issues with outages, and if your screen freezes, I would encourage you to hit refresh and to press play, and that should help to kind of restart your efforts. I also wanted to mention to folks that they should put any questions that they have for Kofi in the Q&A section. I also mentioned that there's a toggle within the Q&A that goes from either the most popular, those that got the most votes, versus the most recent. And as there's some of the questions from the last session, I would encourage you to look at the most recent so we can see the questions that are relevant. I'm going to start things off and reference a book, Black Landscapes Matter, which is the title of a book by Walter Hood and Grace Mitchell of on Black landscape architecture. Tell me about this phrase, Black Landscapes Matter, what it means for you personally, and then the context within the larger field of landscape architecture.
Sure. And it was an honor to be included with my professional big brother, Walter, in that great book. So Walter called a symposium at Berkeley several years ago. It was marking the tragic anniversary of the uprisings in South Central LA, the LA riots and the aftermath of Rodney King, which was in our generation, our George Floyd moment of dealing with police brutality, like really. And he was interested in measuring the progress from that moment in terms of how we dealt with elements. And this is sort of in the middle of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that was the birth of that term that was sort of coined by Walter, and a number of us convened, and we talked about measuring our distance from then to here. And that gave an opportunity for us to put landscape architecture, the design of public spaces, into that broader conversation of the value of Black lives. What does that mean for us? And so, building from Alicia Garza, one of the co-founders of that movement, I wrote quite a bit about the connections between the idea of being seen, the idea of being connected, and the idea of living with dignity and how there are elements in our past in landscape architecture and how we've affected the built environment that haven't enabled those particular places, those kinds of activities to occur. So revealing the legacies of landscapes that we don't associate with the ingenuity of African people, even during enslavement, to people right out of Reconstruction, to the modern era. We've had a presence from campuses to towns to we talked about Emancipation Park as a part of the talk. So that book and that idea was really about elucidating those ideas.
Well, thank you. And for folks that are the design professionals amongst us, I did see Walter Hood speak for the Georgia chapter of ASLA back in our pre-COVID days, and definitely brought a number of great ideas to that conversation. And I want to mention his co-author is Grace Mitchell Tata. So just got that name right. You're welcome to check out Black Landscapes Matter. It's available at local booksellers and others. Let's turn to the concept of root shock and serial displacement, because it really struck me that this is a conversation that Atlanta needs to bring to the center, where we pride ourselves on everything being new with the New South, and Atlanta having a sense of moving past its history to replace things. And the example of Central Park and Seneca Village definitely resonated with me as well. What can you tell us more about this term and where to learn more on this topic of root shock?
Sure. It's a term that comes from psychiatry and psychology. And so this is the advantage of having sort of a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary set of people looking at the same thing. So Mindy Fuller Thompson in particular, she wrote it when she was at Columbia. It's an actual book called Root Shock, which recounts how she's attached this sort of psychological disorder to physical changes in the environment, and really focuses on the legacy of urban renewal specifically. And having been to the South Bronx and been to Pittsburgh since reading that book, I can see the evidence of that. The inability to really connect and build from the legacy of replace leaves you kind of without roots, almost like a plant. Mm-hmm. So that's a great place to look. She's since moved on from Columbia, but still writing pretty actively about it. And having diagnosed this particular issue, she's written 2 subsequent books that I think are also really useful. One called Urban Alchemy, which is essentially her learning urban design while experiencing Paris, of all places, and developing ways of working with communities, not unlike what you all do through Park Pride, to get in touch with one's neighbors, to feel connected, and to build collective action. In her most recent book, Main Street, talks about the transformations of where she is now. So I think it's well worth paying attention to, because often when we are faced with these issues, we deal with the immediate visible physical circumstances that we're dealing with in design, and we don't have all of the tools yet to understand underlying meanings, beliefs, and perceptions. And finding some common ground on that, she helps us. She helps guide the way for that.
Mm-hmm. Can you give me the name of the author just one last time?
Mindy Fuller Thompson, and it's exactly how it sounds: Fullilove. Yep.
Excellent, thank you. I see I'm getting kind of my wrap-up question. Before I go there, I did want to ask you one further follow-up question, and kind of on the opposite side of root shock, I think of looking at instances where parks have played a positive role in honoring their checkered historical context. And I think of examples that are coming up here in Atlanta with the history of Bellwood, with the West Side Park that has been called into question by the community, and really has shifted the thinking of Bellwood Quarry being a name that is emblazoned on T-shirts and things like that, and more of something where we want to remember the history, but we don't want to kind of incorporate that into the brand in a way that is alienating or a microaggression to folks that are experiencing who that park is for. So I'm curious your thoughts on, in our current context, do you find a more of an appetite for taking on those types of issues so that we're telling a broader narrative in terms of history than where we've been in the past?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I don't know as well, but I know where we are in Carolina, we're experiencing a huge of people, new residents, right? Because jobs and economic opportunity, they're coming from all over the world. And I think in some ways that's placing pressure on places, particularly urban, that really communicate a legacy of intolerance and exclusion. And so I think there's internal pressure from Black communities, brown communities who always wanted to revisit this and celebrate these legacies that have been hidden. Change, that pressure has always been there. But I think there's also another set of pressure, which is, there may be consequences to perpetuating the stories of lived individuals, of elevating stories with other people in our societies to whether or not you attract new people or not. So I think there's internal and external pressure that makes this moment really interesting. And I'm hoping that the combination of that results in the resources required. I think with many cities, Atlanta not excluded, we have diminished, in some cases, resources to fund our commons, right? So from design and planning to maintenance to programming, we rely on third-party entities, philanthropy, other things as a part of the sort of the neoliberal project of saying that, our public dollars don't always go to public interests, right? We kind of outsource a lot of things. So my hope is that that flips in a certain kind of way where we kind of say, no, actually investing in parks, investing in empowerment of voices of local people to infuse those with stories that have meaning that will live on beyond their lifetimes is in the public interest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We do have a few more minutes, so I did want to ask another question, and I wanted to call attention to your treatment of Frederick Law Olmsted, and I think you share kind of a narrative that folks don't often hear, and a question that was raised by Atiba Mbiwan, who's one of our board members. In reference to Olmsted, you mentioned that he was part of the abolitionist movement, and I'd never heard any presenter highlight this aspect of his life. How do we get others to recognize?
Yeah, so this is going to be a really interesting year in 2022. It's the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted. I would be remiss, I don't want to correct your board member, but no A in Olmsted. So as a card-carrying landscape architect, I have to say that. but that being said, some stories about Olmsted briefly before we get to even Central Park. Man of leisure, right? Grew up extremely wealthy. Wrote under a pen name for what became the New York Times. His letters are compiled in a book called The Cotton Kingdom, if you're interested, where he traveled the South, went to plantations, went to all these landscapes, and wrote about the conditions there, particularly with the people. So that was a part of his ethic. But also traveled to Europe when royal lands in England were being opened up for public use. So Birkenhead Park, and things of that nature. So that was a part of his calculus in terms of, hey, public spaces in his language could be used to civilize people, which is probably a topic for another time. But it was infused with these two ideas. He led the Sanitation Commission coming out of the Civil War to help with infrastructure, to help the Union Army sort of recover in a healthy kind of way, was offered the head of the Freedmen's Bureau coming into Reconstruction and refused. So he had that legacy. What is different, though, is that he did from Central Park to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago to other communities, had this pattern of huge public park changes in growing urban areas that displaced African American communities. So that's a part of his legacy that we don't talk enough about. But he was an abolitionist. It's true that he actually was active in that movement.
Yeah. And I appreciate you elevating kind of the full dimensions of that story. I think that you're right that as we move into 2022, we will likely hear more as folks are looking to elevate Olmsted and his work, and making sure, much like with some of the other different environmental leaders, that we're getting an understanding of them that reflects the whole person. So let me just kind of draw us to a close here, and let me ask you this is kind of my question. I've been really focused on this conference being an experience of hope, and I'm looking for, in your role as a professional in the field of landscape architecture and as an academic, what gives you hope, And also from your work and the good work that you do, what are you most proud of?
Okay. Well, in terms of what gives me hope, so switching to another hat, I'm president-elect of Landscape Architecture Foundation. And we have an Olmsted Scholars Program where we actually try and reward the best and the brightest students in our profession based on proposals and based on their personal backgrounds. So I've just come out of reviewing our undergraduate awards from every accredited school in the United States for landscape architecture, and to a student, every last one of them have infused a social mission with their environmental mission. And so it's no longer a marginalized or edge kind of conversation. I think that it's a mainstream conversation for the next generation. And so that gives me a great deal of hope. We would not be having conversations like we're having right now when I was in school. So I think that's a measure of movement. Now, what ends up happening due to that, unsure. In terms of what I'm most proud of, probably has nothing to do with my profession, but that my children are growing up in a world where they know that they're going to have to play a critical role with all of us moving forward. So helping them get a sense of agency, get a sense of belonging, helping them on the road to becoming wherever they want to go. That's really the mission of life. So that's really what I'm most proud of, and how that spills over into the built environment. That's great.
Yeah. Well, I can, as a parent of two, and just thinking of what we heard from Al Bangura, I think this is a time where what is different in the world around us is those that we love, that we have been closer to during this experience, and I think that's reflected in our current reality. So I so have appreciated both your talk and this Q&A session. Thank you, Kofi Boone, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for being part of the New Case for Parks.
Appreciate it. Thank you. It was a great opportunity. I wish you all well. Have a great conference.
Excellent. Thank you. So before we take a 10-minute nature break, and we're going to take one this time, we'll check in with Sophia Bork as she introduces two more community heroes being recognized for Park Pride's Inspiration Awards. Don't forget to make your gift now, at least before 2 p.m., to be entered into the drawing for the REI Glamping Extravaganza, and see the chat for the link. When we come back here at 11:15, Maury Wolf from Cox Enterprises, our presenting sponsor, will be introducing our third keynote speaker, Dr. Marshall Shepard. Thanks for being here today, and stick with us.